You're listening to a programme from BBC Radio 4.
Good evening. By any standards, the Al-Hijra Muslim faith school in Birmingham has problems. According to its latest Ofsted inspection report, the pupils aren't safe, the playground is chaotic, the pupils openly rude to the staff, the teaching's inconsistent and the school management's out of touch. It's in special measures and the government's ordered an independent academy trust to take over. But what particularly concerns Ofsted is the way the school segregates the sexes completely from Year 5, and not just in lessons, but at breaks, in school clubs, on school trips. Ofsted says this is not just wrong, it calls it a kind of apartheid and says it's damaging for girls, but illegal under the Equality Act. There's been a long-running court case, and the appeal court will shortly issue a judgment with wide-ranging implications for schools elsewhere. The immediate question is whether segregating children within a school is a bad thing, especially if it's still considered acceptable to have schools that only teach a single sex. There's a wider issue about faith schools themselves. Many are educationally excellent, have an ethical context many feel is missing from secular schools, contribute to diversity in education and multiculturalism generally. But they're also seen as promoting a single dogmatic worldview that some secularists would say is based on superstition, that they encourage intolerance and are inherently divisive for society. The morality of faith schools. Our panel, trundling up the track for a welcome return, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Michael Portillo, Melanie Phillips, social commentator on The Times, Anne McElvoy, senior editor at The Economist, and the chief executive at the RSA, Matthew Taylor. Michael Portillo, where do you stand on segregation within schools?
Well, I went to a single-sex school, but I had every opportunity to mix with girls after class. And I do think that free, equal, easy mixing of the genders is a fundamental British value, and I think that applies to all ages.
Melanie Phillips.
I don't think segregation in itself is a problem necessarily. What matters is whether boys and girls have equal educational opportunities, and there is no reason why segregating boys and girls within a school deprives any of them of those opportunities any more than a single-sex school does. What matters to me is not segregating children, it's what they are taught.
Matthew Taylor.
Well, I think faith-based gender segregation in schools, especially state schools, is reactionary and oppressive. And as for faith schools in general, I think we're stuck with them, but I would impose a requirement for a minimum of pupils to attend who are not of that faith, and if the school can't manage that, then they just have to close.
Anne McElvoy.
Well, I believe that there's a distinction to explore here between separate education for girls and boys, which we have in many different ways, and segregation. And I think we have to be quite careful when we mix up these things. My view of really whether schools should stay open or closed is, are they reasonable, are they tolerant, and is their education effective? I think there are many routes to achieving that, and we have to be quite careful that we don't close down faith schools under the guise of something that we believe we should be pursuing that could be better done in a different way.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Asad Zaman, who's an imam based in Manchester, who also runs a private school for mainly Muslim children, and he's on the line now from Salford. Mr. Zaman, you support, as I understand it, the separation of the genders in school from, years 5 or 6 or so. Why? What's the most important reason in your view?
I think there is absolutely no problem at all with the idea of segregation, and the concept of gender segregation in education is not alien to British culture. We have about 250 schools, fee-paying schools, either boys, which are about 100, and girls, about 150. So this is something very much embedded within British culture, not something alien to it. And all the results are very, very clear, which show that single-sex schools do provide a better environment for getting higher grades. Girls do far better. All the facts are there. The girls generally do far better in single-sex schools than they do in mixed schools, because obviously they have fewer distractions.
Understood. Matthew Taylor?
Well, just to say I checked that research today, and I don't think you're right, actually. I don't think there is any strong evidence at all that single-sex schools are better. But what I want to focus on is your reason for thinking that segregation is necessary. Am I right in thinking that part of your reason, particularly for saying that older children need to be segregated, is that you're concerned about their sexual feelings?
Well, we all know that around the age of about 10, 11, boys and girls become much more aware. And therefore, to help children to stay within the law says you should not have sex under 16. And therefore, if a school can provide an environment that enables a child to stay within the law, that minimises or reduces the possibility of them breaking the law, surely that is something that we should be celebrating, that should be encouraging, rather than...
And do you think it's boys and girls equally who find it hard to control themselves sexually after they reach puberty?
Well, look, we are living in a highly sexualised environment, and there have been so many programmes on television, on the BBC and others, which tell us the amount of access that boys are having to, say, pornography on the internet, and the way that is affecting their attitude towards girls. So therefore, a much healthier environment in which that possibility of either sex being exploited and being abused surely has got to be something positive.
So just to clarify this, because you're very, very clear, I think, which is that you think, as it were, enforced segregation of young people will help them make wiser sexual choices.
Look, this is a matter of parental choice. In terms of this particular
but
school...
that's your view. You said it. Your view is... the reason I'm raising this is that I would argue that isn't one of the biggest reasons that some men treat vulnerable girls badly, sometimes very badly, is actually a lack of empathy towards those girls.
A lack of education, a lack of morality, a lack of understanding of who we are as human beings, how we should interact with the opposite sex or with the same sex. I mean, this is not just a case of sexual morality. This is a case of morality in general.
Okay, so I think we agree about that need for kind of empathy. And I suppose my point is this: if I wanted to guide a boy towards treating a girl respectfully, I think they're more likely to get good advice from a girl than from, for example, an ageing male imam.
Well, it depends who the ageing male imam is.
Of course.
If you're not someone
but do you
from
think
the
what I
society...
was saying is if 14-year-old boy was to talk to a 14-year-old girl and say, how do you want to be respected and treated, and isn't that a really good way for a boy to understand, to empathise, to understand what's appropriate?
Look, within a faith environment, it becomes very, very clear as to how we interact with the opposite sex, the level of respect that we ought to have.
Isn't the point you don't interact with the opposite sex?
In generally speaking. I mean, in this particular school, the Hijra school, it is a co-ed. There are boys and girls studying side by side, except they are separated during various activities. So they are within the same environment, and they are interacting. And besides, when I personally went to a boys' school in Birmingham, and I went to university. University, yes, you interact with with both sexes, and outside the school environment, you're interacting with the opposite sex as well. So I don't really see where the problem is.
Michael Butterman?
Your last answer has made me more confused about your position, because I assume that the opportunity of sexual intercourse in the classroom must be very limited. I therefore assumed that you believed that boys and girls of this age shouldn't be meeting outside the classroom, where they would have more opportunity.
It's not what I believe. It's not what I say or you say. We know the environment. Whatever we say to children, they will behave the way they want to. All we can do as parents is to empower them with a sense of morality that helps them to respect the opposite sex. And we hope that through their faith, through their, as I would say as a Muslim, through their prayers, that will empower them in terms of increasing their willpower to be able to resist any direction towards immorality.
But do you wish to stop boys and girls of this age meeting in drama groups, in playgrounds, in parks, in shops?
There is only so much we can do within the environment that we're living in.
I know, but would you like to stop them meeting?
It's not really up to me. My children themselves went to a mixed school. I made sure that I taught them what morality is and the fact that sex is only within the context of marriage. And one hopes that through that advice, through that parental advice, that they follow it. But you can only pray to God that He guides them, because there's nothing else you can do once they leave your house.
But do you advise them not to meet girls in parks and playgrounds and in drama groups?
What I advise them is that sexual relations should be be within the context of marriage, and therefore anything that leads to any kind of sexual encounter or the possibility of it, they should eschew from that.
And sitting together in a classroom leads them towards a sexual encounter, does it?
It doesn't lead them. You're just increasing the potential of it.
Why? They're in the classroom. Why does that increase the potential of sexual encounter?
No, sorry. The idea is to help them to understand what relationships are once they are able to deal with the opposite sex, which they will be if you have brought them up in a moral environment. So you are setting an example for them that, look, total non-segregation. We can see the environment that we're living in. The number of girls that get pregnant at school, and the figures are quite horrific. All the latest surveys that I've read say that half of all 14-year-old girls are having regular sex. Is that the kind of environment that we want to encourage or to discourage?
I just want to get to the distinction between single-sex schools, of which, as you say, there are lots, and what was going on in this school, which was a mixed school where the genders were divided. Don't you think it is quite different that the boys and girls go to the same building, and then it is implied that gender is such an important difference that they must be led off into different parts of the building to enjoy their education? That's sending quite a strong message, isn't it?
Well, one of the impact of that is they will be more morally conscious, and at the same time they produce far better. I mean, look at this particular school, the Hijra school. It was started in '88, and they had an Islamic ethos. They had segregation from day one. Suddenly, the inspectors they give a report now saying that there is a problem with segregation. For 30 years there was never a problem with segregation, and then this is an excellent school with an 86% GCSE pass rate, A star to C. It's one of the highest performing schools in Birmingham, and yet it has been marked inadequate and put into special measures. Something has gone wrong with the way that inspections are being conducted, surely.
Adam Assad Zaman, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Iram Ramzan, who's founder, editor of the website Sadar, which means Our Voices. She's a Muslim, and also one of the signatories to a protest letter against the segregation at this particular school that was published recently. What's at stake here, in your view? She's on the line from Salford.
Hello. Well, I believe this case demonstrates something that a lot of female and Muslim activists have been seeing over the last few decades, which is the undermining of the right to equality for women and girls of Muslim backgrounds. We've seen the rise of fundamentalist patriarchal movements which seek to reinforce regressive gender stereotypes and restrict women's rights in an attempt to deny women their full and equal participation in public life.
Melanie Phillips.
Could you explain why or whether you think that segregating boys and girls within a Muslim school or a faith school is any worse than having, say, a Muslim or any other single-sex school?
Well, I think I don't agree with the idea of single-sex schools in the first place anyway, but I guess the argument that is made for single-sex schools is that they do allow for boys and girls to flourish academically, and some studies have been done that would show that, although as we've heard earlier that those figures are disputed. I think what we also need to bear in mind is the intention behind the segregation. In this instance, at the Al Hijra, I think we need to remember that the reason that Islamic schools are segregated are not in order to enable girls to flourish academically, but because they're primarily, in certain very austere interpretations of Islam, they're seen as the source of temptation and male arousal from puberty onwards. And unfortunately, in some circumstances, puberty can start as early as 9 for some of them. So from 9 onwards, they can be ordered to be veiled, segregated, and prevented from taking part in many activities together.
OK, but we're looking specifically at this business of segregation, and I want to sort of continue to focus on that. There is no suggestion, there's been no suggestion by Ofsted in the case of this particular school, for example, that the segregation of girls and boys is a matter of concern because the girls are being subject to an inferior educational experience. The only concern seems to me to have been the concern that boys and girls aren't socialising. So and indeed the High Court found there was no discrimination here against girls. Obviously, the appeal court has yet to rule.
Yes.
But there is no evidence that this discriminates against girls, that this leaves girls in an inferior position because of the segregation.
Well, that is being challenged at the moment, as you've pointed out. And also, I think, in this school, there were books in its library that condoned rape and violence against women. It's a school where misogynist modesty codes are enforced on girls as young as 9, forcing female pupils to cover up. It's a school that applies a regime of complete segregation for all lessons, breaks, school clubs, and trips. And I think it's about the intention as well behind it, because they are taught from a young age that it's wrong for boys and girls to mix. I think that is a cause for concern for me.
I understand, but aren't you confusing the values that are being taught in such a school with the segregation? You mentioned the book in the library. Supposing, for example, that boys and girls in this school were being taught in the same class, but were being taught that women should have a subservient role, were being taught that Islamic doctrine was not simply a religious belief, but was established fact, and a whole range of other stuff. Would that be okay in your view?
I don't think that's okay at all to be teaching young children such regressive and backward.
So the issue is not segregation for you. The issue is the values being taught. Isn't that right?
I did say earlier on as well, segregation is an issue for me. I think it's absurd that in 21st century Britain that we can't educate children together. Why do they even need to be separated? I think maybe there might be certain activities where they can be separated, such as PE, for example, but I don't see the need for segregating boys from girls, and especially from the age of 9. What are we teaching them, that from that age onwards that suddenly they're going to instill certain values from one another? They're going to arouse temptation in boys or girls?
Anne McElvoy?
I want to explore this dividing line in your mind between separation and segregation. Surely it's okay to be separate, subject to being taught reasonably and to respect and accept the values of other people, and it's the segregation that's wrong. But we seem to be moving from one to the other with disturbing rapidity.
I think I've made myself clear, and to be honest, many women's rights campaigners and Muslim people themselves are speaking out against
many
this
women's
issue.
rights campaigners often have a lot of time for separate spaces and separate spheres.
They probably do, but we're specifically talking about, say, Southall Black Sisters and Inspire. These are quite progressive groups, in my opinion.
In your opinion, that is a very key phrase, actually, because we all have opinions. I have opinions on education. I have opinions on... Yes. And that's absolutely fine. But I think here we're on the moral maze. What is inherently wrong, do you think, about people exercising choice to be separate, even if some of us don't approve of it, as long as they're not inculcating harm into others?
Well, I would argue that there are harmful values being taught at this school. I've already mentioned the books.
You have. You
and
have.
Also,
so
again,
time short.
It's also about the intention, though.
Sorry.
It's also about the intention behind this. Why exactly are boys and girls being separated at this school?
I understand
and
that.
it's because
but
of
to you, that's
certain
the moral
religious values.
That's the moral risk. Then is what is being taught. But let's just come off the school for a second and go a little bit broader as we close. Isn't it really the case that what worries us is sometimes people making choices that we don't understand or don't like, and that we have to police ourselves a little bit ethically to say, well, where is the evidence that our view is absolutely the right one? Does that not concern you a little bit in this whole argument?
Well, I'd also talk about this about the fact that this school was also getting public funds as well. It's not the duty of the state to provide schools catering for every shade of belief or philosophy.
But we're a pluralist society. Isn't that a good idea that, within the limits of a tolerant society, yes, we should have a pluralist approach to what we provide, whether it's in the state or the private sector?
Yes, I'm all for pluralism, but what are we saying about the direction in which our society is heading? If we have a school that is separating girls and boys from such a young age, where it's instilling ultra-conservative gender norms and values which are seeping into the everyday life of minority communities. UK law should be protecting young girls and boys from those who seek to treat them as second-class citizens. To allow such gender segregation within those faith schools, I think, and even in this school, is a disaster for future generations of British girls growing up in Muslim communities.
Ramzan, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Professor Anthony O'Hare, who's Professor of Philosophy, Head of the Department of Education at the University of Buckingham, a former government special advisor on education. You're OK with faith schools, all of them?
I will defend faith schools, but in a qualified way. And my position is, I've got two poles as to why I think faith schools, in a certain sense, are a good thing and should be allowed. The first is, I don't think that the primary responsibility of education is with the state or the collective. I think it's with parents. That's a fundamental position that I have. But secondly, I think that liberal principles require that there is genuine, and I mean genuine, I will use the word correctly, genuine diversity in education. And I would refer people to Mill on Liberty, who said that a general state education is a mere contrivance for moulding people to be exactly like one another. And this mould will be that which pleases the predominant power, which will be the state. And it may be a democratic state, but there can be such a thing as democratic despotism. And I think that I would pursue the Millian line by saying that there is no monopoly of wisdom in any field, and particularly not on education, which is an essentially contested concept. And so the idea that the state should lay down exactly what happens and impose that on everybody, I think is a form of despotism.
Michael Patilla?
Very clear and powerful points. When you look at Northern Ireland, though, where the communities are still at odds with each other along a religious divide, don't you suspect that segregated schooling is actually perpetuating the divide?
I think that I said I would defend faith schools in a qualified way, and I think that they have to recognise, or all schools actually, have to recognise our heritage, which is classical Christian Enlightenment heritage. And so they have to acknowledge the spirit of that. And obviously there's a danger that, or it's not a danger that is always happens, is that some faith schools will not acknowledge classical Christian Enlightenment roots of our heritage. And I think it's very important that all schools should do that. And I mean all, including state schools, where classical education is woefully neglected, because that is what we are.
I'll come to those values in a moment, but even if schools in Northern Ireland are respecting classical Christian Enlightenment values, the very fact that children are sent either to a Catholic or a Protestant school, does that not worry you in the context of the divide?
No.
Right. Coming to your broad framework of classical Christian Enlightenment values, does that include acceptance of homosexuality, abortion, contraception?
What do you mean acceptance?
Would a school that said homosexuality is unacceptable, abortion is unacceptable, contraception is unacceptable, would that school fall foul of your limitations?
Well, I think that what you're proposing is itself a strong secularist, materialistic, egalitarian position, which is not itself neutral. So it's not as if there is one set of beliefs.
About what I'm saying.
I'm worried about.
What's the answer to the question?
I think that if a faith condemned these things, which actually was true of most of Christianity until very recently.
Yes, exactly.
I think they should be allowed to teach this. Yes,
They should be allowed to condemn them. Yes.
well, they should be allowed to teach it. Yes.
Thank you.
Matthew Tanner?
Do you think a school can promote faith without being a faith school?
Sorry, I don't understand.
What I mean by that is how would it be if we said that parents should be free to choose schools that emphasise the value of faith, but not that we should allow schools which are effectively only open to one faith? So, the freedom of parents to choose the education they want for their children. They want a school that emphasises faith. That's fine. That would go along with your principles, but not to go so far as to say that we would have schools which effectively are only open to children of one faith.
I think that. I don't know who's going to legislate this. I don't. As I've already.
I'm asking for the principle. I'm asking for the principle. Would that be a good balance between the concerns that you have, that it gives parents freedom, but it avoids segregation?
I would actually prefer that the school admissions should be dictated by the school. So if the school said we only want, you have to be a Catholic to come to this school, that's fine by me.
Okay, so
providing, of course, that the school operates within the general liberal framework that I've been mentioning.
When we face moral dilemmas, we have to look at the real world consequences of things. Now, the real world consequences of your position would be, and already is actually, the rise of more monocultural faith schools. What I'm trying to do is achieve a balance here between two core Enlightenment values, the value of freedom and the value of universalism. It seems to me you're only interested in freedom. You're not interested in the universalist principle.
Well, I am interested in the universalist principle because I said that the schools would have to operate within this fundamental liberal
and isn't rubbing along with each other part of that kind of, in practice, part of that liberal tradition?
But I would want the schools to be able to define their own ethos and, up to a point, their curriculum, because also I do not believe that there should be a national curriculum.
Let me be clear. Even if the ethos and values of the school clearly fly in the face of the Enlightenment values which you espouse, you would allow them to still educate children, young minds, control those young minds, because you would say the abstract freedom of the school is more important than the actual impact on those children.
Well, it depends what you mean by working within Enlightenment values. I've already said that I would like a genuine diversity. I don't think that you or I or anybody else have a monopoly on wisdom. And providing the school is not undermining the consensus with which we all live, of course there will be disagreements on the various matters that Michael Portillo has mentioned. And I don't think those disagreements should be simply hidden under some blanket edict from what Mill called the predominant power, which wants to mould people to be exactly like one another. And that's particularly dangerous where there are genuine and deeply felt disagreements that are not indefensible.
Professor O'Hare, thank you very much indeed. Our last witness is Afia Hirsch, who's a former social affairs and education editor and the author of a book called Brit, (ish), a book about national identity, due out in September, I think. You went to a Church of England state primary school yourself, I think, but don't like the idea of them now. Why?
I wouldn't say I dislike the idea of faith schools, and I want to make it clear that I don't have a humanist agenda or an atheist agenda. My real issue is with the inconsistency that I find in state funding of faith schools. I think that it's increasingly clear that we have a narrative of promoting integration in this society, that we see social integration as a social good. And I think that it is logically inconsistent for this to be a core value in this country, and at the same time fund schools which ostensibly segregate children by faith, and for which there's also evidence that there is a knock-on effect in segregating children by ethnicity and social class. So for me, you can either have a country where you throw away the idea of integration and you publicly fund schools that segregate children, or you embrace integration and you cannot logically also support using taxpayers' money to segregate children by faith.
Anne McElvoy.
So I send children to faith schools. I also pay taxes, which help support those schools. What am I doing wrong?
I don't think you're doing anything wrong. I think parents always send their children to the schools they feel will give the best education. I don't know your personal circumstances, but the evidence is that across Europe, faith practice is in decline, especially church membership is in decline. At the same time, faith school attendance is on the increase. And the only
so people would seem to like faith schools,
the conclusion that most researchers have come to is that the reason that parents are sending their children to faith schools is nothing to do with the doctrine of faith, but because of the academic results that they deliver. And in this country, it's certainly true that
do the researchers have a window into all those parental souls?
They don't have, but they have matching the practice and religious attendance that underpins faith against the numbers of faith school attendance. So the fact that faith schools are becoming increasingly popular in a more secular society suggests that it's not necessarily just to do with religious values that people choose them. And anecdotally, I know many parents...
It might also be that parents have certain values and they may themselves not be absolutely religiously observant, but they might like the feel of those values. They might like the fact that they're often set against an aggressively secular society and increasingly secular politics. So the idea of sort of pluralism does matter here a bit, doesn't it?
I think that the problem is in a lot of the hypocrisy around this debate. There are certainly many parents who are happy with the values that faith schools teach. There's also, I feel, an increasing discomfort with schools of particular faiths and the values that some of them are promoting. And I feel that it is very problematic to single out faith schools of particular faiths, especially Muslim schools, which we've seen a disproportionately higher amount of concern about. I think that the reason politicians are unwilling to touch this is because Church of England schools are so popular with parents. But I think that in the interest of fairness...
Why not simply deal with the schools that are causing, or perceived to be causing, problems and leave the rest alone? Why would that not be the more sensible way to go than pussyfooting around things that are problematic?
I would certainly advocate dealing with the schools that are problematic, but even the schools which are not problematic, there is evidence, for example, that Catholic schools select a disproportionate number of more affluent pupils than schools that are not Catholic. So there are the issues of the faith in question, but there are also the broader social implications of faith schools and the fact that they do have segregationary tendencies that reach beyond faith. And I think that is very problematic and needs to be addressed.
Melanie Finnan?
You say integration is a core value. Integration, though, into what? Presumably what you're getting at is integration into British values. That is what our core value is, that we should integrate into British values. Is that what you're saying?
It is what I'm saying, with the conditionality that I don't think that we have in any sophisticated way articulated what those values are, and that's a separate but related problem.
OK, well, let's park the fact that we don't know what they are, but we think that we should be integrating into them, which is a bit of a strange concept. But anyway, do you therefore think that British values are more valuable than other values when it comes to integrating children, the need to integrate children into schools?
Well, it's difficult to say that in the abstract without having articulated what British values are. I personally don't agree with Anthony O'Hare that we should be promoting Christian Enlightenment values, because I don't think that we have arrived through any consensus at an agreement that that's what British values are.
So what are the values that you want to integrate children into?
I personally, and I have no particular legitimacy to say this, but I would say that tolerance for other beliefs and cultures and awareness for young people about healthy relationships, social and sex and relationship education is key. I think we should be turning out adults who understand consent and healthy relationships.
Okay.
These are all things that would be part, for me, respecting free speech and individual choice.
OK. But indeed, tolerance, I would agree with you, is absolutely core British value. But you're not prepared to tolerate those parents who want to segregate children on their grounds of their deeply held religious beliefs. You are profoundly intolerant of religious belief.
I'm not, and I don't in any way...
You just exhibited it.
I don't in any way seek to criticise the role of faith in society. I think that faith absolutely has a place in people's identity, heritage and life.
Even
However,
faith that preaches intolerance in your book.
I don't think that the place for faith is schools. I don't think that state-funded schools should be segregating children by faith. We wouldn't tolerate this in any other aspect of the
Where
public
do you
sector.
think the concept of tolerance comes from?
Imagine hospitals or trains segregated by faith. It's inconceivable.
OK, where do you think the concept of
important.
tolerance comes from, if not from Christianity and indeed the Jewish values that informed Christianity? Aren't Christian faith schools actually the very embodiment of core British values?
if you're suggesting that we should somehow elevate Christian faith schools and say these are the true British faith schools that we should promote, I think that's really problematic, because
Why?
we do live in a multicultural society.
Do you not accept that that's where they come from? The belief in the integrity of every human being, the equality of every human being, the respect for human life. These come from the Bible.
Are you suggesting that the Judeo-Christian tradition has a monopoly over tolerance, faith, and
No,
respect
I'm
for
saying
others?
that it's absolutely integral to the values that you believe in, which are tolerance and equality and all that stuff, and to put them in one box and to say that faith is in another box, and, you know, in order to promote your values of liberalism and tolerance, we have to somehow suppress faith schools, is such a fundamental error, because that one comes from the other.
I think that, to me, is kind of symbolic of the problem with faith schools. You end up supporting one specific doctrine or tradition over others, and I think that is completely unsustainable in a multicultural society where we have different traditions, each of which have their own merits and their own traditions of tolerance and respect for others. And I think that to promote one over the others is incredibly divisive and a great example of why this is a problem.
Afia Hirsch, thank you very much
Thank
indeed. Gosh, we covered a lot of ground. Michael Portillo, what did you make of our first witness, the Imam from Manchester, Mr. Zaman? His first argument, interestingly, was the higher educational advantages of segregating the sexes, but it came down to sex in the end, didn't it?
I feel a sense of failure in as much as we didn't quite pin him down. I mean, Iram Ramzan, the second witness, made the point that she thought the intention behind this segregation was the idea that girls, in particular, could cause arousal in boys. And I thought Asad Zaman sounded rather as though that's what he thought, but we never quite nailed him to the sticking point of saying that. But much of what he did contribute implied to me that he thought that from a certain point onwards, children were sexually driven, that arousal was the thing that had to be avoided, that sexual intercourse was the most important thing to avoid, that this might be not only in the classroom but outside the classroom. So I have a feeling that he was saying something awfully like what the second witness suspected him, or rather suspected was an agenda.
Anne McElwain?
Well, I think it was an interesting segue, that, because I think Michael is right. I think effectively what Mr. Zaman was preaching was a segregationist view of education, that segregation being that he really didn't trust girls and boys being in the same space very much at all, and he was trying to find ways to justify that. But what Ms. Ramzan was saying was she seemed to start out saying that she disliked this segregation, and I think she heard correctly what the first witness was saying. But then it did shade into any critique of separateness, at which point I think something came up which was going to thread through the programme, was people just saying, you know, here's something I do like, here's something I don't like in education, and then saying that they disapproved of other people wanting it. I think at that point, you know, that difference, and it's sometimes very difficult to bring out with the witnesses, nailing jelly to the wall on occasion, but I do think it's an important one. And it's also, you know, Professor O'Hare then went on to take it into a philosophical dimension.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Matthew Taylor?
You see, I thought, listening to Mr. Zaman, that there was a dissonance between what he has to say because his religion says it, and actually probably, from what I could tell, the advice he gives his own children, or, you know, what actually he accepts goes on in society. And I think that what worries me about faith schools is that it's a place where we take that ambivalence and we kind of say to children, we're going to force you into a kind of context which will somehow mean that you don't have to face these conflicts that we have to face and we have to deal with, and that worries me.
Melanie?
I think both of our first two witnesses embodied a confusion between values and segregation. You know, Mr. Zaman, I think your people are right to say that what Miss Ramzan suspected was what Mr. Zaman was sort of getting at. But in both cases, what the objection from Miss Ramzan particularly was to the values, and I think this came out. It wasn't so much the segregation, although she did say she was opposed to segregation. But when you pressed her, what she actually objected to was the values that she suspected were being smuggled in in under this segregation, which I'm sure she would say was what Mr. Zaman embodied. Now, I think people are entitled to object to those values, but we are discussing whether segregating children within a school is in itself inherently a bad thing.
The most important word there is within a school, and I don't think we dealt very firmly with this. There are lots of single-sex schools, but it did strike me that you elevate gender to a mighty place when you say, OK, boys and girls, you're coming through the same door, and now you must spend the rest of the day separately.
But some people religiously...
We must move this on to the more general principle of faith schools. But before we do so, the second witness's, Ms. Ramzan, additional point was, this segregation did tend to undermine equality, and particularly the equality of girls.
Well,
do you think that was valid?
I don't think there's any evidence for that. I think that the values taught in certain schools may well undermine the equality of girls, and that's a bad thing. Any kind of discrimination or disadvantaging of girls is a bad thing. But I have not seen yet any evidence that segregating children by sex within a school disadvantages girls or anybody else any more than a single-sex school does.
But I think the point of seeing the point that she was making, which is an approach which tends to see girls as temptresses, exactly, takes you to a position in relation to judging girls and young women and the behaviours that they have and the clothes they might wear, which I think is a very dangerous position to be taken.
Can I move you, because we're running out of time, to the general point here? Professor O'Hare, I wasn't entirely clear about his position here, very much for faith schools, but within a context of a Christian enlightenment.
So I thought what was really funny or strange about Professor O'Hare is that he ended up with what felt like not a very British position at all, because he seemed to be wanting to promote abstract values, so the abstract value of parental freedom in the face of real-world realities. Because when I confronted him with the real-world consequence of this freedom will be outcomes that I don't think you want, he didn't really want to talk about the real world. He wanted to go back to the abstraction.
The key word here for him was classical Christian Enlightenment values, because classical Christian Enlightenment values would include an abhorrence of homosexuality, abortion, contraception and premarital sex. So it's not the defence that many people might be looking for.
Anne McElvoy...
I disagree. I disagree. I just take a different view, Professor O'Hare. I thought he was very welcome to hear a liberal defence of faith schools. Thank goodness, there's plenty of us sort of liberal folk like faith schools, and I think we're in danger here of everything sort of being switched. The idea, all society's ills laid at their door. It's all about problems with Muslim schools. Can I just quickly finish, Matthew? The point that he was making, which I thought was a very good one, that J.S. Mill, no less, who we would have loved to have had a witness on the Moral Maze on this.
He's been on several times.
Being dead is no barrier to appearing. But universal state education does have certain things that are for it and certain things that are against it.
But weren't you dissatisfied?
Weren't
you dissatisfied with the fact that he simply wouldn't deal with the fact that his principle might lead to full-scale segregation in the school system?
A one-word answer.
No, I don't think that's what he was saying at all. I think he was saying that you can combine liberalism and faith schools. I think it was pretty simple, as J.S. Mill often was when he was being brilliant.
OK. Better leave it there. That's it for this week. From our panel, Anne McElvoy, Melanie Phillips, Michael Portillo and Matthew Taylor, and from me, until the same time next week, we're off to work out why none of us make it to the BBC's high-paid list. There's a real moral issue for you, if you like. Anyway, until next week, goodbye.
You can download many more BBC Radio 4 programmes for free. Find these at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.